Hello, everybody. It is George. I am here. I am so glad to be here. I'm about a week late, but I am so glad to be bringing you the 20 items that are going on eBay. Now, this usually would have come out right at the end of June, but my eBay assistant was on vacation, so now is the time. I love taking 20 items and setting them aside, doing a little bit of extra research, finding out a little more about what makes them interesting or novel or fun or something that we haven't tried online before, and then we put it out there and we see, using eBay auctions, what the market is. I've got some fun things, so let's take a look. Of course, it is summer, and summer is a time for vacationing, and so the first thing I have is a lovely souvenir folio given by Northwest Airlines, Northwest Orient Airlines as of 1947, and this trip was taken in 1952. They did not go to Hawaii, Alaska, or the Orient, as Asia was referred to by a lot of folks back then, but they would fly in these really big Boeing Stratocruisers. This is about 3 years before jet transportation starts to replace all these big old propeller airplanes. So this is what you're on, with the big dome in the front so that you can see out, and they have flyers for all the other places that you might go with them, and some important things like your place card to let people know your seat is occupied and that they're not to sit there. They have route maps so that you can see that now they serve not just Tokyo and Shanghai, but they also serve Formosa, which became Taiwan, and are starting to serve a bunch of other places in Asia, and this made them second only to Pan American. So it was a really big deal when Northwest was given these overseas flights right after the Second World War, and they made the most of it. They could even tell you how much it would cost to fly to Atlantic City from Hawaii. And it was a lot. It was $316. If you wanted to fly from Manila, it was $875. Some of those prices might not be considered too far off from today's prices, but airline travel was not cheap in the 1950s. This is before things were deregulated, and so when you bought this ticket, they all got to agree how much you were going to pay depending on how far you were flying, and you paid that, and it didn't matter who you flew, and they did not have super savers, and they did not have all of those special fares. You got what you got, and you took your flight. You usually dressed up for it, and then they gave you lots of fun reading material. So this will tell you all about flying to Hawaii. This is before Hawaii is a state. You can be there tomorrow, meaning it was an overnight trip still. We're ahead of the jet era. So, and you would fly to Oahu because there wasn't any service to the outer islands. The Orient Express Stratocruiser, the finest and fastest to the Orient, and this shows the various places that you can fly through Seattle, Anchorage, and Minneapolis. So it's really fun. A lot of people like extinct airline ephemera. Northwest didn't really go extinct per se. They got merged into Delta, and after the merger, for a brief while, were the largest airline in the world. So Northwest lives on today, but not as its own separate thing, and that's why pieces like this are popular with people. I'm starting this at $9.99. I think that there's probably $20 or $30 value in this if you broke the pieces up and sold them separately, but I love the fact that somebody went on this trip and got all of those together and kept them all together because it was a very special trip for them. Now, this next little piece is something I wanted to put out because it was very special to my mother, and I am taking some of her collections to the Rose City Vintage Show on the 15th and 16th, but I promised the viewers that I would put at least a few things aside that everybody would have access to. And this one was so special to her, I decided to make this the first thing. This is a music box. This belonged to her sister originally, and it is a jester or a harlequin. We'll move it up so you can see the detail. The detail is really quite splendid. It's like they're dancing on a stage. And in fact they are, and I'll pull the pin for a moment. He dances, and I remember you always had to shake his left leg a little bit to get it free. But he dances, he works great, and he plays a wonderful tune, a minuet from Mozart, which is why I can't let it go longer, because YouTube doesn't like us to play original music that we don't own. So, but it's a Royga Swiss musical movement. They were one of the biggest in the industry. And this piece was designed by Designs by Ingrid in Chicago. Designs by Ingrid was an upper middle seller of interesting things that they imported from other places around the world. They did the designs and then had them sent to them. And this was one of theirs from the late 1970s. Music boxes had been around about 200 years before this one was made. Switzerland is where a lot of the modern music boxes started in the 1770s because they figured out how to attach bells to their watch and clock movements. Then by the 1870s, they made giant, and American companies too, made giant, huge music boxes that played large discs that had perforations in them that made sounds when little clips ran over them. Or they had a cylinder where they would pluck the cylinder as it goes. Very similar to what's in these, but on a much larger scale. Well, then when Edison came out with the phonograph, well, people stopped buying the big music boxes because they'd rather have records, but the little music boxes always stayed popular, and there's been an industry in Switzerland up until this time. And we know that they stayed popular because 200 years after the Swiss first start making them, we find a little company called San Francisco Music Box Company operating in a pier in San Francisco in 1978 and selling little music boxes to tourists. And within about 10 years, they were in malls all over the country. So music boxes have remained very popular. I think this one's really sweet. It does work really well. I think we're going to start this at $39 and just see where it goes, because none like this have been online recently at all. I could not find another example of this anywhere. And I have to say, my mother would look around and we never found another example of it anywhere either. So I don't think there's a lot of them around. Well, if you were not born with a silver spoon, or if the stork is coming to your house spoon and you know someone who needs to be born with a silver spoon, this might be the example, because this one is the stork silver spoon. I'm going to set this down and show you some of the detail up really close. Look at those great glasses and the eyes, and then the wings come down and the legs. And the legs stand on top of the spoon, and that is true in the back as well. You can see the little claws where his feet are. If you turn it this way, you'll see that in 1910, someone was presented this spoon, and there's still the etching very lightly. That could be buffed out if you wanted to give this as a presentation piece, because this piece is sterling and it's marked so on the back. Sterling, you can buff out monograms and replace them with your own or none, whereas silver plate, you end up exposing the underlayer and it doesn't look right because it's not the same metal. So sterling's what you want for this sort of a thing if you're going to re-gift and repolish. The little mark to the side of sterling is an interesting Rococo cartouche above the patented 1907, and that is the mark of Mauser. Mauser sterling was in New York City. They sold on Fifth Avenue for about 10 years in the 1900s and teens. And then the founder died and they went out of business. They were merged into another silver company. So their reign was not long, but they did very well for a certain amount of time, and these were considered luxury goods when they were sold new. And they're still considered a little better than your average sterling spoon. This is 1.1 ounces of silver, which is worth about $20 or $22, somewhere in there. I'm starting it at $19.99 because I feel confident that the value is well beyond the sterling value and that it will find its value. The last one I saw sell on eBay went for $35. So we'll see how this one does. The stork story, by the way, boy, that goes way back. There's talk that it goes back to ancient Greece with Hera, but we know that the pagans used to marry at the summer solstice, and in the northern countries where they were, the storks would fly away right about summer solstice, and then they would come back 9 months later, and lo and behold, a whole lot of the women in the village were pregnant with their first child and about to give birth. So it became a connection in the minds of the pagans that the storks had something to do with the delivery of the babies. And then Hans Christian Andersen wrote a book in the early 1800s that basically said the same thing. That became a very nice dodge for prudish Victorian parents who did not want to explain the large number of babies coming down the row to their children. So the stork delivered the baby became the common ruse. And that's why we have this really great spoon. So for those of you who are level 2 or level 3 members. Thank you so much for your help and the support that you give that makes these videos possible. And you are getting early access. This will be the first of 2 this month. Yes, we will make it up and we will be back on track at the end of July with another one of these. Lil Abner was probably everyone's favorite hillbilly in the early 1900s. Al Cap, whose signature is below, was the comic who did all of those strips, and they were around for a long time, up until I was a kid. And so a lot of younger people are aware of Lil Abner, but they were especially aware of Lil Abner in 1948 because Lil Abner catches a shmoo. And a shmoo, which you see a couple of them here, are very amazing creatures because they don't mind being eaten, they reproduce easily, and you can basically do anything you want to them and they will just come back stronger than ever, and they're happy to have it. And this was really a reflection on the notion that Lil Abner, who, when you see his depiction, he actually was supposed to be a little bit brighter, more earnest, more on the ball, trying to figure things out. And figuring out the shmoos took care of a lot of problems that people were facing in terms of poverty. And so it was something of a social message. It was even used in the 1948 election when Thomas Dewey accused Harry Truman of offering people everything, including a shmoo, in his platform. It didn't work. Thomas Dewey ended up losing, but Al Cap didn't, because the shmoos were so popular that the readership of his comic, which had been out for a generation, doubled. So Lil Abner is cute and fun and should sell for somewhere around $9.99. At least that's where you're going to start him. And I just think he's great. And at one time, he was a very important comic character. Well, next to me, I have an old friend of ours who used to be the President of the United States, or at least I have a mask of an old friend of ours who used to be the President of the United States, along with an ashtray from Plains, Georgia, home of Jimmy Carter, the 39th President. And I am selling these two as a lot. Jimmy Carter, he deserves a moment of attention. He is in hospice. He's not likely to live a lot longer. He's almost 99 years old, I believe. And he had a quite surprising rise to the presidency. He really came from out of nowhere. And that was because Watergate was so psychically damaging to the nation that they wanted somebody who wasn't mainstream Washington politician. And Jimmy Carter definitely was not considered that. He'd been a governor. He got involved early in civil rights because he bedded the U.S. Navy, and he saw that the forced integration of the U.S. Navy did not cause the breakdown of the services, and that black and white people could work together and deal with each other. He had a lot of history in governance, but not directly in Washington, D.C. That probably made his presidency a little rough. He did some pretty amazing things at the time that were controversial, that people either really thought were great or really disliked, including pardoning people who had dodged the draft for Vietnam. He also opened up trade relations with China in a much bigger way. It started with Nixon, especially because of Watergate, to do rubber masks and to go to Halloween or masquerade parties or political gatherings. Something like, I just want to say how much I appreciate the American people. I don't do a great accent, but you get the idea. Plains, Georgia turned into this tourist destination, which it still is, because of its illustrious resident. We probably know him the best for in the reselling business, however, is Habitat for Humanity, because he's been very instrumental in organizing and being involved with that group. And because of that, now we have Habitat for Humanity resale stores that we all like to shop at all over the United States. Now, my blacklight is being a little bit funny and not cooperating today, so you're going to have to see this Fenton Owl fairy light in its custard form. But if you go to the listing picture, you will see a lovely glowing green, because this is Fenton's custard, and this is the custard, this and the lime custard, that glow bright green because of the uranium in them. And that's why people are calling them uranium glass. This guy came out in the late 60s, and he is a fairy lamp. You can see the hole at the top. But he was originally a spinner. I have one in black that was given to me, and it has a tape around it with various sayings, including "Let George do it," which is why it was given to me as a gift. That's an old expression basically saying, oh yeah, give it to that guy, he's a sucker. But my guess is that they had that as one of the things that you would dial with the beak because of George Fenton, the grandson of the founder, who was starting to really get involved with the operations of Fenton around this time. And I'm sure that was part of the joke, was let George do it. There were other sayings too. And so this originally was meant to spin, and the nose would end up on whatever saying was on the little tape. Well, it didn't take long for a lot of people to break them that way, so Fenton started making them without the tape, just as fairy lamps, and this is one of those. And you can tell that it is a fairly early one. It's just got the Fenton oval mark. It does not have a year mark, so we know that this one's sometime in the 1970s and probably the early 70s. It's just a really cute little piece. I'm starting this one at just $29, but we know that uranium glass and fairy lamps are just going crazy right now, so I suspect that we're going to see a much higher price on them at the end. But I bought it right, and sometimes when I buy something right, I just like to start it off at where I need to be to clear my expense and my investment, and then see where it goes. And I realize that other resellers tell you, oh, don't do that. And, you know, it may have to do with the fact that I have some audience who likes this sort of thing and I know comes to me for uranium glass and anything that glows under a black light. But I really think that the market for this sort of thing is so hot right now. It is one of those things that we can let people tell us what they're willing to pay, and we'll come out just fine. This next piece comes from a design house that you have heard of, and a designer, at least in part, who you have never heard of, who is one of, if not the most influential designer of the 20th century. And you think, well, how could that be? Those designers that are really famous are all really well known. Well, that's because this is a Raymore Contempora teapot by Steubenville. And Raymore is the secret to this one. So we're going to take the lid off. Everything is in terrific shape. No cracks, no chips, no damage. And we'll show you the mark on the bottom. So Raymore started way back in 1941. A fellow named Irving Richards started product distribution, and he worked with some American companies. And then after the war, he started to work with other companies in Europe as well as the US, and he worked with so many modernists and worked with them to form some of these designs. He worked with Russell Wright when Russell Wright was involved with the Steubenville firm, and that's where this comes from. Notice there is one glaze skip here. This is not damaged. That is a factory glaze skip. You can tell because the line that was supposed to be down went up. So this was technically a factory second. There were a lot of factory seconds of Raymore made dinnerware because the designs were not that easy to execute. And that was true of the Roseville Raymore, it was true of this Raymore pattern, and it was true of other Raymore dinnerware patterns. Irving Richards' motto was that Raymore was modern in the tradition of good taste. So yes, they're looking for a modern shape, this exaggerated handle, but there's some thought to it. The handle is wide and flat, so it's actually easy to hold and pour. So even though it's very elongated, it's not hard on the person using the piece, which is the point, because it is supposed to be functional after all. It is dinnerware. He worked with Eva Zeisel and Hans Wegner and Walter Dorwin-Teague and Gilbert Rodi and Ben Seibel. And then, of course, as a lot of us know, he then went to Italy and he worked with Aldo Landi and the Bitosi factories and a whole bunch of other really great European designers. So Raymore is very collectible no matter what it is. If it says Raymore, there is a customer because it does indeed reflect modern design in the tradition of good taste. This particular piece of good taste is going to start at $49. I believe it's worth about double that, but we will see what the market is for this particular line, and I do have several other pieces of it, so if it turns out that there's a good market for this, well, I have a bunch of other serving pieces as well, and we'll start listing those. In the late 60s and early 70s, a drink became very popular in the United States, along with a type of cuisine that had been sort of overlooked and not really thought of unless you lived near the borders. And that was Mexican food and the margarita. And so people suddenly wanted margarita glasses. You could buy margarita mix at the store, and they wanted something to put their mix in and have margaritas at home. So Bartlett Collins, which was an old company in Oklahoma started by an oil man who found a glass guy who needed the gas reserves on the oil properties to make glass, and Bartlett Collins started way back in, I think, 1912 in Oklahoma, when Oklahoma was just barely a state. And it really turned into a very, very major concern. And screen print glasses and barware were the thing they probably did the most. I think one of the most famous things they did was for the bicentennial, a bunch of tumblers with the stars and stripes on them, which was considered controversial at the time because as late as 1968, Abby Hoffman was arrested for wearing a stars and stripes shirt because it was considered desecration of the flag. The Zodiac became a very popular thing to at least dabble in or pretend to know about in the late 60s and early 70s. At least you were supposed to know what your sign was, and if you needed a good stupid pickup line that everybody in the world had heard before, you could walk up to someone and say, "Hey, what's your sign?" And that was supposed to be very suave and sophisticated for about the first 10 minutes that people did it, and then it suddenly was kind of, it turned into a joke like, "My sign is closed." Well, my sign happens to be Leo, and we are coming up on Leo's birthday, so I thought, well, I'll put this out because this could get to somebody in time for a Leo to have a very happy birthday toast. And it is a nice big piece. It's in good shape. It has a few really minute scratches on the orange that you see when you hold it up to a bright light like I'm doing now, but are really not visible when you're actually just looking at the piece. So it's in good original condition. It's not perfect in that regard, but it also doesn't have any damage in terms of cracks or chips or anything that would make you not want to use the piece. It's also pretty heavy. These were hefty because Oklahoma had low gas prices, and so they could ship things everywhere from Oklahoma pretty cheaply, so who cares if it's big and heavy? Well, that changed a few years later with the various fuel crises, and then Bartlett Collins started making things a little less heavy than they had before. I think it's really fun and cool, and we are going to start this at a very low price of $9.99. They typically seem to sell for around $30 to $35. And since we're talking about drinking, well, here is something that's another drink-related piece, but this is an advertising piece, and this is for Howdy. And Howdy, you see, copyright 1920, and it came in bottles only, which was actually a big deal because soda came primarily at fountains where they had to mix everything. So the fact that they're saying we're only doing bottles means we're trying to distribute it to you through the stores. And there is the mirror, which I just smudged, but it's in great shape. A fellow named Charles Leiper Gregg was the originator of it. And you would think, oh, I don't know why I should know that name, but if you're a soda person, you might have heard of them because his next drink in 1934 was 7-Up. And 7-Up was a lemon lime lithiated soda. So it was actually sold more as patent medicine during the Depression. And lithia, well, yes, it was lithium, the mood enhancer that they were putting in 7-Up. And that went on for about the next 12 years. So 7-Up, the slogan was, "You like it and it likes you." And oh, howdy, I guess it did. So I think this is interesting because it's a precursor to a more famous company. Howdy did not have a patent medicine angle to it, and that's why when 7-Up took off, he decided that was the drink and he gave up on Howdy. So you don't see a lot of Howdy stuff. It's $9.99 starting. I'm noticing that these sort of cute advertising mirrors, especially for old soda brands, usually seem to bring 25, 35 or more. I haven't seen this one online either, so we're going to give it a shot and just see what it goes for. Now you'll notice I'm starting a lot of things pretty inexpensively this month, and that is deliberate. It has to do sometimes with what I have into an item. It has to do sometimes with the time of year where we're selling the item. I figure that people need a little more incentive in the summer to sit in front of the computer and not be outside and not be at a real world antique show or a flea market or doing that sort of thing. So we are going to start things at prices that are going to get people's attention and then let the market take it to where it should. We've got a couple of things because it is summer, and summer means that certain sports are going. And the first thing we have here is a baseball. And this one has its original box. It is not from when this fellow was in the leagues, but it is a very, very famous player. This is Ted Williams, and that is a real signature. And that was how he signed things informally. He signed all of his regular papers for legal purposes and such Theodore. And that came into play when he died because he had in his original will that he wanted his ashes to be scattered at Key West. And instead, two of his children insisted that he had written a note in front of them, and they swore in an affidavit it was true that he wanted to be cryogenically frozen like they did so that the whole family could be together again someday. Now, there's a lot of talk that the piece that he signed that allegedly said that was a cocktail napkin or something that was to be given a fan, and that the family just wrote what they wanted to have happen on it and said it was his signature because it was signed Ted Williams, not Theodore. But the court allowed it, and so poor Ted Williams' head is frozen in a locker in Florida somewhere, along with one of his children who has passed on. So I guess they will all be reunited. A very strange end to a person who was really so remarkable in his time. The last person to hit 400. 400 means 4 times out of 10 at bat you hit the ball. That's just unheard of. Since he did it, actually. He played for only the Boston Red Sox for all of those years. He retired in 1960, but is still really well known because he was so good and so important. And he had so many records, and a lot of them still stand. So Ted Williams, we're going to put you in this nice box here and get you ready to go out to somebody who appreciates sports and appreciates getting a nice signed baseball that is absolutely his signature without paying the cost for a COA. People ask me all the time, should I pay money to have a certificate of authenticity done if I have a celebrity's autograph or a sportsman's signature? And the truth is you need to figure out what the value would be with and without the COA and then make your decision, because Ted Williams signed enough baseballs that this will probably sell maybe in the $50 to $75 range, but it could cost you more than that to get it authenticated. So you really have to look at whether it makes sense to you for the purposes of your collecting. If it's because you want to keep the piece and you want it to stay in the family and you want people to know it's real, well then yes, maybe a COA makes sense. If it's for reselling, you've got to weigh the cost. And since we're on sports, the other sport that starts, and it's about, I think a month away, is preseason for football. And I have this box, and since I'm going to be in Seattle shipping, and the likelihood, although not necessarily because he's very popular in Oklahoma where he played football and was a Republican congressman for several years, but this is Steve Largent. And this is his commemorative Wheaties box. And yes, people do collect the commemorative Wheaties boxes. Here we go. He was a nice looking guy, and he was a very, very, very good wide receiver. I remember cheering him on many, many times in the old Kingdome when that was still in Seattle, and that's where they played. It was so great. The concrete roof made it so loud in there. It was just deafening to the other team. There's his records at the time that the box was issued, and it says that he's closing in on some other records because they knew he was going to get there, and this was done while he was still playing, which is a little bit unusual. And so it's just fun. There are people who collect these, and I figure some Seattle sports nut will be happy to pay at least the opening bid of $9.99 to get them. We talk about Hummels a lot, and Hummels conjure up a definite image in people's mind. They either think of them as really sweet, cherubic, angelic children, or they think of them as, oh, that thing that my mom and grandma collected, and we've got about 50 of them in a china cabinet. Well, Hummel was more than that. Hummel was actually the last name of an artist in Germany who happened to be a nun living in a convent. And her name was Maria Innocentia Hummel. And you can see on the back the signature that says M.I. Hummel. Goebel was a little pottery company in Germany making lots of figurines and nice, pretty things for the home and trying to figure out other products to make. And when Mr. Goebel was in a fair at Leipzig, he saw postcards that had her depictions of children on them, and he said, oh, they're so sweet and they're so cherubic and people would love these. And he approached her and she agreed because the convent really needed money to allow Goebel to license her art to make little figurines. And that's where the Hummels came from. Well, this is right before the Second World War. The first ones came out and they were a big hit with everybody except one German who really, really, really hated them, and that was Adolf Hitler. He despised Hummels. He hated the fact that they were shown as cherubic and angelic and a little plump and sweet, because his notion was that the Aryan nation should rule over everyone, and that was not what our children were supposed to look like. They were not supposed to look like brainless little dumplings, as one of his sycophants called them. And so poor Maria was suddenly really on the outs, and so were all of the convents in Germany. They were allowed to continue to exist, but they couldn't produce any more art. They couldn't do anything at all, and they were given very few resources, and a lot of the women in them were terribly malnourished during the war and or got terrible diseases, and unfortunately, Maria Hummel was one of them. She got tuberculosis and died shortly after the war was over in 1946 and never got to see what a giant success her sweet little children ended up being, because as soon as the GIs started spotting them in the stores, they said, oh, this is neat, I'm going to send one home. And that was when they started really becoming known around the world. So now her work is very well known, and in 1984, Goebel decided to do this Madonna and Child for the 75th anniversary of Sister Hummel's birth. And I think it's just very nicely done. I'm sure she would approve. The child definitely has Hummel-like qualities, but it's very regal. The dress is very well designed. The hair, this is something they really took a lot of pains with. They didn't crank these out. These are really well painted. Better than most of their 1980s stuff, in my opinion. And they came in two sizes. This is the 9.5. I believe there's an 11.5 inch as well. But it was well received because it was a great tribute to her. And it was really one of the first times her story had really been told since everything had happened to her. So I'm glad to be able to share that interesting background. And maybe it will make you think a little bit differently of Hummels when you see them in the future. Fortunately, after the war, Europe resumed its position as one of the main places for modernist design. And one of the designers who came to light in 1952 in Paris was Hubert Givenchy, or Givenchy as a lot of people say in the United States. He started out by doing those puffy shirts and a softer look in dressing, and immediately just set the world on fire. The New York fashion critics all said he was the most amazing designer, that his first collection was better than people who'd been in the business for decades, and boy, did he capitalize on it. Givenchy designed Audrey Hepburn's dress for the movie Breakfast at Tiffany's. So if you're trying to figure out who was that guy, why do I think I know that name, well, that might be the reason. Within about 20 years, he was designing everything from the interiors of Lincoln Continentals to costume jewelry. And this piece is a Givenchy piece, and it's a rather nice piece and pretty emblematic of some of their designs from this era. I believe this one is 1980s approximately, right about the time he retired out of the business. It's got big faux pearls. They have no scratches or damage. Down at the bottom, you're going to see the Givenchy mark right there with Paris and New York. You see the gold is a little bit shinier because by the 80s we're starting to get into shinier gold backing. It's nice and big. It's about 2¼ inches around, and I just saw a set like this with the earrings, but with damage on one of the pearls, sell for over $200. So Givenchy is definitely a big name, and still a big name, and a big name on the resale market. So I was very happy to find this. I don't find many Givenchy pieces. It's kind of like finding Chanel. It's right up there. And so we're going to start this at only $39, but I believe it will sell for quite a bit more because I think people who understand what this is will find it. Well, while we're on 1970s and 80s fabulousness, I have something here that definitely was considered either really high style or very crass, depending on your viewpoint at the time. But this is Wallpaper, and I'm going to turn it over so that you can see the figures because they're a little bit in flagrante. But it is real from the 70s. And wallpaper is something that people don't always think to look at. Now, this is especially 70s because of the nude figures, but you can tell right away also by the color scheme. You can also tell by the label on this one that tells us that it is by Imperial Wall Coverings of Cleveland, Ohio, and it is the right-on pre-pasted, and that was something new. Pre-pasted vinyl where you didn't have to use all of that horrible glue was a big deal, and that's why a whole lot of places got wallpaper treatment in the 1970s. But really it starts way back farther than that because people were painting murals way back in Roman times on plaster as frescoes in houses. It was very popular in Newport, Rhode Island and in the mansions of New York in the mid-Victorian period to have large murals painted on your walls or screens. And so wallpaper, which started to be made mass production, became an option for a lot of people who wanted that look, who could not necessarily afford to have a bevy of painters painting all the walls in their house with original art. And wallpaper seems like it goes in and out of style. It was big in the Victorian era. It went out for a while. It came back in the 1960s and 70s, and it is starting to come back into style now. And this is certainly enough to do an accent wall or something really fun. It's about 1 2/3 rolls. And if I'm reading these measurements right, it looks to me like you might be able to do maybe a small accent wall with this amount. I would think if it were, you know, gosh, I mean, it depends how high up the wall you go. You just have to be creative, I guess. But there's plenty of it to use, and that's the important part, and the fact that it's a really cool, fabulous vintage print. And that's the reason it's worth looking at wallpaper. It's worth selling it online. I'm going to start this at just $20 for the 2 rolls. And I think because of the subject matter, that if it hits the right person and somebody can think of a good use for it or a good place for it, it could sell pretty easily for 5 times that much. So we're going to give it a try and see who has the imagination to find a new home for it. Of course, some people just take pieces of it and frame it and then sell the rest too and use it as art. So do what you like with it. I think it's very fun, and I'm looking forward to seeing who the ultimate purchaser of something like that might be. I'm also curious who the ultimate purchaser of something like this is, because this stuff is starting to really go crazy and sell for big prices. And I actually think, even though it's in a box that says made in China, so I'm going to tell you right off, I don't consider it vintage because it's made in China, but I do consider it collectible because this is drug rep swag, as they call it. If you put drug rep into the listings, you will find a bunch of stuff that was distributed by drug reps as little premiums. And this guy, he needs a battery in here to show you, but he's never been used before. He is actually a clock, and his name is Memo Man, and Memo Man even has the original instructions, the instruction manual. It's more like an instruction sheet of paper. I don't think Memo Man is all that difficult to figure out how to use. But what's interesting is that, oh, he pivels and swivels and pivots around and he can clip little notes on. These were just fun things that were being given to people who worked in hospitals, administrators, nurses, staff. Just fun things to keep the name of the company's drug at top of mind awareness. And it worked really well. It worked too well. It caused overprescription of drugs. And by the end of the 2000s, most companies that ran big healthcare places were starting to establish standards of ethics that said, we don't take any of that stuff anymore. One hospital in Minnesota famously packed up everything they could find and sent it all to Cameroon as a donation because there were towels and t-shirts and sweatshirts and all sorts of stuff. So they gave it to the poor. And because of that, there is a big collector market now for drug rep memorabilia. And I have to give thanks where thanks is due. I know this because of Nurse Flipper, because she watched it stop being distributed when she was a nurse, and she caught on. And when she came to one of my estate sales in St. Petersburg, Florida, and I had some of this for sale and it had been there for 2 days, she scarfed it all up and made a bunch of money on it. And I said, oh, why are you buying that? And she explained to me, you can't do that anymore. And that's what makes it collectible. To me, vintage is a certain age, but collectible is another matter. And sometimes things become collectible just because we're not allowed to do that anymore. And that's a great example of that. So I'm starting it again at $9.99. I'm seeing things that I think are as interesting going for upwards of $100. So we'll see how interesting Nexium Memo Man is to somebody else. But I thought he was pretty cool. Now, this is another advertising piece, but this one nobody seemed to have an issue with. This is a 1950s Michelin Man ashtray, and it is in really wonderful condition. The Michelin Man came out in 1894 when one of the people involved with the company, I believe it was Edward and Andre Michelin were brothers, and I think Edward was the one who saw a stack of tires in front of a fair that they were going to, an industrial fair in Lyon, and said, that looks sort of like a human figure. We should make a logo out of that. And so he had one commissioned, and that's where Bibendum, that's the name of the Michelin Man, came from. And Bibendum has a bunch to do with it. It used to be a drinking term in Latin, and it's a very complicated connection between the term Bibendum and the Michelin Man, but that is his name. This is in really great shape. It is not Bakelite. It's a later plastic, more like beetleware. It's made in France, of course. They were distributed widely in the United States, as were Michelin tires and Michelin guides. And Michelin is still considered a premium tire brand. So this guy, we're going to start him at $49. I see them sell oftentimes about double that. And what's great is he has no burns, no scratches, never been roughed up. So I think someone's going to have fun with him. Now, this piece I got for a couple of reasons. One was because I thought it was an interesting story about a place I didn't know about until I saw this. One was because I showed it in one of my videos when I was shopping, and one of the people who was commenting on the video said, I hope you got that piece. And that made me think, oh, I really better get that piece. And fortunately, the dealer was at the next show I went to in the same area and still had it, and I bought it. And it is this. It is this bull. And of course, I like the bulls anyway because Treasure Craft famously did the bull and matador sculpture, and it was probably the biggest of their paired sculptures that they sold. I think they sold more of those than anything else. And I just noticed a lot of other companies followed suit, and I thought it was interesting to see what this company did, because this company is Hungarian. And let's see if we've got that upside down. Let's turn it that way for you. There is your mark, Majolica, spelled with a K, Hungary. 1830 is the date when the factory started in this town, and the town's name, which is at the angle you can't really read, is Varoslad. And Varoslad is a place in Hungary that spawned some really famous people, including the fellow who ended up going on to start Herond Porcelain got his start at the pottery factories in Varoslav. So it is still a redware making center. You see the red on the bottom there. They call it Majolica because the glaze is similar to a Majolica glaze in terms of the way it's made, and it's got that little bit of shine to it. But it's very much a modernist bull from about the 1970s. You can just tell by the design, the concentric ring eyes, the rings around the neck. They have definitely made efforts to make this seem a little bit more like a modern art piece and a little less like a representation of a bull in a field. So I think it's really cool. It's a tiny town of 1,500 in Western Hungary that was founded mainly by Germans, and the fact that they're still doing ceramics there after all of these centuries is pretty impressive. So I just thought, this is a neat piece. I'm going to start it at $29. And if you were the person who said, gee, you really ought to buy this, well, hey, you know what? You ought to really buy it too. And here's your chance. I think it is really neat, though, and I'm sure somebody will buy it and enjoy it. Well, from a brown bull, we go to the Brown Derby. And yes, it is the Brown Derby, the Spanish-looking building at Hollywood and Vine. We have a lunch menu from the Brown Derby. Imagine who might have touched this. Now, a lot of people touched it, so it's not in perfect condition. You can see it's yellowing. It has some little tears around the edges. When you open up the lunch menu, you see it was written in. I mean, this is how people did stuff. So you could get gefilte fish, hot or cold, for 85 cents. A live Eastern lobster half for $1.50 and a whole for $2.25. Wow. And that was a lot of money, because you can see that spaghetti plate is 85 cents. Spaghetti with chipped beef au gratin. I'm not so sure that sounds like one of their best meals, but they made really cool stuff like the Derby julep mold, so you wouldn't really care how good the food was after you had one of those, I'm sure. I just love the idea that this could have been sitting there when somebody famous came in and picked it up, and this was the menu that they used. And I thought it's really cool, but the condition isn't great. So I'm going to put it together with another menu that has a similarly illustrious history. This is from the It Cafe, also near the corner of Hollywood and Vine. The It Cafe was actually on North Vine Street in the bottom of the Hollywood Plaza Hotel, and it was called the It Cafe, even though it opened in the late 30s, because it was owned in part by Clara Bow, who was the It Girl, the first really, really famous actress of the silent age to cross over into talkies. She had sex appeal, she had it, and her cafe had it too. Clara Bow had a really interesting and rather difficult life, but she ended up doing very well for herself. And at a certain point, for about 6 years, right before and during the Second World War, she had a partnership in this cafe. And their food, I have to say, looks a little bit better. It's dinner for four, a satisfying charcoal broiled porterhouse steak, 5 pounds. Wow. A steaming casserole of lobster and shrimps for $1.50. So I just thought this was fun. It's got good graphics. It's got the original rusty paper clip, so it's going to have some stains. These are not perfect by any means, and I know I'm a big one talking about condition all the time, but when you get into some of this paper ephemera from places like this, where there's going to be a high demand just because it has celebrity cred, well, I figure that we're going to do a twofer and start them at only $9.99. So somebody should be really happy with these and have a lot of fun figuring out what they would have ordered if they were sitting there. The Brown Derby, in fact, this particular establishment in the old Spanish design, as opposed to the one that looked like a Brown Derby. Well, this is where the first few episodes of I Love Lucy, when they moved to California, were filmed, because there is a great scene where Eve Arden is sitting on one side, and then Lucy and Ethel and Fred are in the middle, and there's another movie star on the other side, and they are just completely beside themselves, of course. Now, this one does not have the paper label with the identification of the maker on it, but that's okay, because it's easy to research and find out that this is indeed a Lefton wall-hanging mermaid from about 1970, and she is in such great condition, and she has the rhinestone eye, and mermaids are so hot right now. In the 70s, we start seeing the return of Made in Japan, but it's on a paper label, not an ink stamp. So that's how you know it's not 1930s. Also, you don't see a lot of wear on this, even though it was hanging on a wall for a long time. It was taken care of by a good housekeeper. So she doesn't really have dust marks. She's got her dolphin's got her eye in, and it's just cute as can be. Mermaids, of course, became very popular after the Second World War. A lot of people were stationed in the Navy all over the world and suddenly had been cruising, had been overseas, had seen oceans and dolphins and all sorts of things. And so if the bathroom became festooned in them, well, that was just kind of fun. And guys seemed to like it enough, and women seemed to like it enough, and so very cute mermaids started appearing all over American walls in the 1950s and 60s. By the 70s, it's kind of going out of style, so this is one of the last ones that's made. She's got her original wire hook. Everything about her is perfect, and we are starting her at $49. Now, I have other mermaids going with me to the Rose City Vintage Show in Portland. I have a collector out there I've known for many, many years who loves them. So I'm taking some out there, but I wanted to have one for you in this sale because I think they're just so great. And she's just so flawless. So we're going to put her out and see who likes her as well as I do. And that brings us to our very last piece. And our last piece is a very pretty vase. And it's a surprisingly lightweight vase for what it is. It is cloisonné, but look how deep those colors are. And look how there's just a little bit of metallic in that background. It's almost translucent in the blue going to that metallic glaze. That's because in Japan, they started really playing around with cloisonné. The Chinese made it in the traditional manner and didn't change anything, but the Japanese thought it was really interesting to do some different stuff with it. They made it more lightweight, and so they coated the insides with enamel to make sure that they were vitreous, meaning they wouldn't leak. And that is a difference between they and the Chinese pieces. There's no country of origin mark on it at all. You just have to know. But this weighs something like under a pound, and if it was a Chinese piece, it would weigh about 3 times that. Cloisonné is formed by bending all of these little wires and then filling with enamel. So it's a very specific process. It's very time consuming, and then they have to cook it all in the kiln so that the enamel expands into these voids and creates all of the design that you see. If you drop this and bend it, pieces of enamel will fall out and the piece is ruined. So a little bit of care goes a long way with these, but they are metal, so they ship easily enough. And I just think it's a really beautiful one. I believe this one is early nationalist because of that translucent glaze with the metallic, and that means you're looking somewhere in probably around 1920 to 1930 on this piece. I think it's just very pretty and very stately, and I thought the colors were fun. I am starting this one at $49 because I think that that is a very, very good price for it. And I really think it's worth about $30 more than that. We'll see if the market agrees with me. But in the meantime, we will have another video like this coming to you in a few weeks, and we will give our level 2 and 3 members early notification for early access, and then we let everybody else in on the deal after a few days so everybody gets a chance to see these neat things. You can go right to the links in the description and trace it back to eBay, see whether the piece is still available, see whether it's sold and for how much, see how the bidding is going. It's a great way for us all to learn together, even if you're not in the market for any of these things. It is interesting to see how other things do when you put them online on eBay auctions, especially in the middle of the dog days of summer. So I'll be curious to see how this goes. Thank you for joining me, and we'll be back again with another one very soon.
If you enjoyed this video, check out this one. Also, click thumbs up to like this video and check the description for information about our Patreon, our memberships. We've got a lot of different levels with different perks and bonus videos and early content. Also, please do check out our website, theantiquenomad.com, for appraisal help. And we'll see you again for more adventures in the antique and vintage community soon. Bye for now.